One of my favourite tracks in the entire world is Spa-Francorchamps. The drivers absolutely love it as well, but they love it for entirely different reasons to me. I love this track because of the specific and different technical challenge it throws up for all of the teams who have to adapt their cars to suit this very, very different circuit. What am I talking about? Well, even the mechanical components of the car have to be designed in certain circumstances around the loads that go through the car as they bottom out through the Eau Rouge and Radillon complex. That's something that no other circuit on the calendar provides. It's a load case that the teams have to design around, but the whole layout of the circuit provides different challenges all of the way around, and we're going to come back to some of those details. But coming into the Belgian Grand Prix weekend, there were some really big changes, not to the track, but to some of the cars, and Ferrari was the one that really caught my attention to start off with. It seems like a fairly innocuous change. They've revised their rear suspension, as you can see here, changed the angles of some of these aerodynamic elements, suspension elements, Tina's going to be on my case. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, you should be having watch of some of the other episodes of Tech Talk on F1TV. Now, it may look like a fairly innocuous change, but actually the change here is more than skin deep. Ferrari trialled this for the first time on a filming day, as I understand it, a few days ago. But the real change could actually be internal. It could be something that we can't see. As I understand it, Ferrari have changed some of their suspension internal components. They may even have changed the transmission casing. I'm not so sure about that. But that does mean that the rear end of the car should perform slightly differently and allow the team to use a different range of ride heights at the rear of the car. Now, they have been caught out earlier this season, even last season, on running illegally low rear ride heights and getting disqualified from races. They're hoping to avoid that and to be able to operate the car in a different window. Now, if this works for Ferrari, this change could really change the whole makeup of the 2025 Formula One season, or at least the second half of the season, and Ferrari could become a much bigger factor at the front of the races. Of course, as we've learned with Ferrari though, it's an if it works, not when it works. We'll have to see how that plays out. And another team that's going to be having to see how things play out when they've put new bits on the car, well, it's Red Bull Racing. They've turned up at Spa with some really fundamental changes on the car. But before we get into the details of the massive upgrade package that they've brought to one of Max Verstappen's home races, the Dutchman, after all, was actually born in Belgium, let's talk to one of the key people in his team, Paul Monaghan, who always gives us a really interesting insight to what Red Bull are up to and what they've changed about the car and why. Anna Francis was asking the questions.
Well, we have a front wing which is mildly revised in its geometry. It's odd, it's a sad consequence of our rules. We'll make a little change to one bit of it, and by the time you've cascaded through the entire thing, it's an entire front wing. It's a shame that, we've lost some modularity, so the design change to the front wing itself is actually quite small, but it cascades right through it. We have a slightly revised side pod. If you look very carefully, it used to be multiple intakes, and now it may be fewer. And we've improved the pressure feed to it a little bit, which means we can push more through it, which means we can shrink our exit, which means we can make a small gain downstream. It'll more come in the warmer races in here. I mean, here, if you can't cool your car here, you've really got troubles. And we've got minor changes to the rear wheel bodywork, and we just been able to do it because it's a very small part, it's a small gain, and off we go. Good enough?
You touched on it there, but what exactly drove the changes to the front wing elements?
The front wing change is an ongoing process by which, in the CFD world, you release a wing, but you carry on working with it, and you think, oh, if we change this, we change that, we get slightly better characteristics out of it, and eventually you accumulate these little gains into a big enough gain to say, if I release a front wing now, I can have it by this race, and then it will, we've got, 11 left to go or something, 12 left to go, I don't remember. So rather than hanging on, we can release it here. We've got flap trims to cope with this place and Monza and so on. But we get the new wing a bit sooner. So it's an iterative process rather than a sort of leap, if you like. And it's just an ongoing research, which eventually peters out and we've got it in 2026.
Now, as ever, Red Bull Racing aren't particularly keen when we get all nosy about what they've changed on the car, but being nosy is exactly what I want to talk about here, because that's something that Paul was just talking about to Anna there. Now, this is the nose that Red Bull Racing started the season with. Now, this is Monaco Grand Prix on Yuki Tsunoda's car, but have a look at the shape of it. The tip of the nose picks up on the front element of the front wing, and it's quite a smooth transition. We've seen wings like this going all the way back to the 2022 Ferrari and a few other iterations of that. Very nice, very simple, very fundamental design to this generation of car. But at the start of the 2025 season, Red Bull started experimenting with a shorter nose that picked up on the second element of the front wing. And typically you'd see Max Verstappen using this nose and Liam Lawson using the long nose, though in this case obviously it's on Lawson's car, not Verstappen's. But you can see how the nose has been reshaped at the tip and only picks up on that second element. Now, these nose changes don't mean that Red Bull has to do a new front impact test, because the actual impact structure is inside all of this and not the external structure. So they're not having to re-crash test the car every single time they change the nose, because that would be hugely expensive when you see what they do next. So this nose was found to create a car that was a little bit more tricky to drive, a little bit more twitchy, and has caused a few problems not just for Lawson but later Verstappen and pretty much everybody else who drove this car. So there has been some chopping and changing with noses, but not nearly as much chopping and changing of noses as we saw in free practice 1 today in Belgium. Have a look here. This is Red Bull's latest iteration of the nose. Now, it does pick up on the second element of the front wing again, but it's a much blunter tip, and it's a really quite different concept. It almost looks a little bit ugly, a little bit brutal. It looks quite drag-inducing, but it clearly isn't. The other thing that Red Bull changed was the upper edge of the front wing. It's an interesting design, not something completely dissimilar to what we've seen before, but it is quite trimmed down to the point where they can't even fit the sponsor's logo on the upper element. Now, this nose and front wing arrangement was swapped in and out of Verstappen's car all the way through the practice session as they back-to-backed it with a number of different aerodynamic components. But before we get into those different aerodynamic components, Paul Monaghan had a few more things to say to Anna.
You also touched on the side pod changes there. What was the reasoning behind that, and how have they changed?
How have they changed? I better allow you to go and look at the car. Why have they changed? We got Hungary, Singapore, Mexico coming, and this 3-week gap between Silverstone and the Belgian Grand Prix allowed us the time, and our locality allowed us to do the side pods, which had been teeing up for a while. Visually, it's quite perhaps you might see it as a large change. It's visually bigger than perhaps the aerodynamic yields and rewards will be for us ultimately, but what it means is with races like Hungary coming up, if it's 31, 32 degrees there, it's quite tough. Mexico is a unique challenge, so hopefully we've set ourselves in a position where they are less awkward for us. Time will tell.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it earlier, but what else is there to come with this car with further changes in the rest of the season?
Well, aren't you wanting to open Pandora's box? We will apply changes as and where we can, pending the yields we find, and pretty much the sort of inputs to these changes are going to peter out now, and now it's the time required to manufacture, produce, fit and operate. That's going to be the drip feed. There will be more changes which you will receive in your submission, but yeah, there'll be a couple more and then they'll probably run out.
Well, as ever, Paul Monaghan there giving us some insight into what's going on at Red Bull, but he always tries to keep a few of the secrets back because he doesn't want to give his rivals a bigger advantage. And it always suggests we take a closer look at the car, which isn't always easy to do. And one of the reasons it's not always easy to do is Red Bull doesn't always like us to take too close a look at it. So let's have a really close look at the car. One of the changes to the side pod that we've seen is the merging of this duct in the side pod, which used to be, and they put the bungs in, they wouldn't take them out for us unfortunately, but when you see the car out on track you can see how that duct has all been merged into one. It used to be two separate ducts earlier in the season. But we can get a slightly better look at it with this bit of footage here. Now you can see the lower duct now has been blended into the upper duct, and this upper duct here for cooling the stuff underneath the bodywork has been extended slightly in that direction. And as we heard from Monaghan, it's all to do with the races coming up. You've got some hot races. Monza's traditionally quite hot. Hungary is a low average speed circuit that's always very, very hot, and one of the toughest challenges in terms of cooling a car on the entire calendar. But the thing is that I don't really get with Red Bull making that change at this circuit is that Spa has quite a high average speed. It also rains quite a lot in that part of Belgium, and the forecast suggests that that might happen again this weekend as well. A high average speed track like Spa, you tend to tighten up the cooling. You tend to run a little bit less cooling to reduce the aerodynamic drag. So it's interesting to hear Monaghan saying that they're opening it up because of the races that there are to come. Why not just bring those parts to Hungary then and have a high temperature package and a high drag package with a high temperature package, and then a low downforce, low drag package, which you'd normally expect to see at Monza. And Monza is an interesting race because it's such a high speed race. You'd run a smaller cooling duct as possible, not increase the size of them. So I think there's a bit more to it than simply opening up the cooling because the races are going to be a bit hot to come. I think Red Bull have actually found some aerodynamic gains with this package, and you can see another area where they found some of these aerodynamic gains by not quite copying McLaren's homework but going down the same route. And you can see these revised fairings on the inner edge of the upper wishbone of the front suspension, straight out of McLaren's copybook. Really nice little elements, really nice little aerodynamic advantages coming from that. And it's something we're going to see, I think, a few other teams try. Notably, though, Red Bull don't seem to have gone into it with the lower inboard wishboard mounting points yet, whereas Mercedes and McLaren have both done that. But that's not the only thing we have to look at on the Red Bull. Have a look at the side pod, because we really looked at the side pod. Duct change, well, look how much narrower the tip of the side pod is up here. They can barely fit the O of the sponsor's logo on that leading edge. They're really tightening up the car and changing the package. And remember what I said about this not just being about increasing cooling? Well, have a look at the cooling outlet here. They've blanked most of it off because this is a high speed, high average speed circuit. And you can see it a little bit more clearly here. Normally you get a bunch of gills and slots and slits all the way along here. They haven't done that this weekend because they want to reduce the drag. Again, if you wanted to increase cooling, you'd open that up, not close it up. So again, I think the Red Bull upgrade package is all about aerodynamic gains. And it's not the only Red Bull branded team that's had some significant changes. While Red Bull Racing has had some management changes, so has little brother Racing Bulls. And speaking to the new boss about changes at Racing Bulls, not to the management structure, but also to the car, Anna has Alan Permane.
Yeah, we've got three smallish changes aerodynamically. We have a new top wing that we haven't used this year. It's specific for this circuit's downforce level, so a little bit lower than we've used in the past few races. And then we've got a change to our rear brake duct. There's a what we call a drum flick on that. That's been repositioned, gives it a little bit more downforce. And then a change to the diffuser, quite a small change to the rear of the diffuser. Some of it's been made a little bit stronger in metallic parts, but also a change in geometry as well. As I said, they're very subtle changes in geometry at the rear, just to aid efficiency, to give us a little bit more downforce, a little bit more load. And we've changed the edge. One of the parts of the diffuser edge, when we run the rear radite quite low, gets damaged, and of course as it gets damaged the performance drops off, so we replaced that from a carbon piece to a titanium piece. We had a bit of weight we could use, so that's just stronger and should last longer.
Well, that's a pretty interesting change we just heard about on the diffuser of the Racing Bull, and I can actually show you what Alan was talking about down here, because you can see just on the lower edge of the diffuser, you can see those new titanium inserts just at the lower point there, where they've replaced a little bit of carbon with a titanium insert at the bottom. That's really interesting to me because it says that the Racing Bulls car is now significantly under the weight limit, in that they're actually using some of that weight budget to put heavier parts on the car that will resist the damage that they've been seeing on a purely carbon fibre part to the rear of the car. So it's a heavier part, but right at the back of the car and right at the lowest point. Really interesting change. Little details like this, though, aren't they wonderful about Formula One? But getting the car right for Spa is a real challenge, as I started the show talking about. It's a really mixed up track, essentially, and that's what I love about it. And Alan was good enough to give Anna a little bit of an oversight of how you set up a car for Spa-Francorchamps, or rather how you set up a car for a bit of Spa-Francorchamps.
Spa's quite a specific track for downforce, because you have obviously three sectors like you do in every track. The first one has a very long straight on it, the third one has a very long straight on it, and the middle sector is actually quite twisty. So you can actually use a range of downforce levels here with a very similar lap time. So what teams tend to do. Of course, you want straight line speed, but here being Spa, there's a big consideration on the weather. So everyone will have one eye on the weather, and if it's going to be wet, then more downforce obviously helps the drivers.
That's a fascinating insight into how you set up a car for Spa, or how you don't set up a car for Spa. And we really saw it in free practice 1, a massive difference between the different approaches of different teams. Red Bull Racing was super quick in a straight line and clearly dominated the first sector of the track. But in sector 2, the twisty bit, they weren't nearly as strong. McLaren was much better than Red Bull by a huge amount, in fact. And then Mercedes were quickest of all. And when you stitch it all together, the ultimate lap, if you stitch together the fastest first sector from Red Bull, the fastest middle sector from McLaren, and the fastest final sector from Mercedes, was 0.6 of a second quicker than any driver managed in free practice 1. So it's clearly impossible to get a setup that works on every element of this racetrack, and I think that's quite wonderful. But free practice 1 also threw up something quite surprising. Not just that Red Bull were quick in a straight line, which is generally unusual for them. They've always gone for high downforce philosophy setups on their cars. Who can remember them having big wings at Monza, going much slower down the straights, but going really quickly around the corner and having a faster lap time overall? Well, they've gone fast down the straights, which for them is fairly unusual. The team you always expect to be quick on the straights, Williams, have actually lost a bit of speed on the straights based on the free practice 1 data, and they've got an enormous upgrade package on their car as well. And before we get into some of the details on it, Anna was talking to an unusually cagey Dave Robson.
We brought probably our major aero update package for this season. So a few changes to the floor, mostly around the fences at the front and the edge wing. A few changes to the side pod just to complement that and improve the flow generally to the floor. So yeah, we're hopeful that that's going to give us a useful step in performance this weekend.
You touched on the side pod changes there. Could you talk a little bit more in detail about that, and have there been any changes to the coolers as well?
Yeah, so two main visible changes to the side pod, I'd say. First of all, the inlet is shaped slightly differently, but that's really just to preserve the total air flowing through the coolers, so the cooling hasn't changed. And what that allows us to do is just lift up the underside of the side pod, gives us more of an undercut, which drives that airflow back towards the rear of the car. So in terms of the coolers themselves, no, nothing's changed, so that's just a complete carryover.
Obviously, there are some visible changes to the car with the floor edges and fences. Are there any changes that are less visible?
No, I don't think so. Obviously, the detail around the fence changes you can't really see unless you're underneath the car, so they are slightly differently cambered and profiled. The trailing edge detail is slightly different, but to be honest, it's pretty difficult to describe.
Well, that was fascinating in as much as Dave was willing to say, but I think he was really downplaying the significance of some of these changes that Williams have introduced on the car. And the first part I really want to draw your attention to is the reshaped side pod cooling duct. This used to come along down here. It used to be a bit bigger and it used to have a slightly more rounded edge, but they've really just sort of run a line through the middle of it to raise the whole side pod up quite significantly and manage that airflow underneath it. And you can see the effect that's had on this really lovely bit of footage here. You can see the big undercut on the lower portion of the side pod, and also how it's really feeding down to the edge of the floor, which you can see beautifully here. And that is a big change for Williams. It's going to fundamentally change the aerodynamic performance over the rear half of the car. And at the front of the floor, the change gets even more dramatic. Have a look at this. They've really sculpted what some people call the floor edge wing. Along the top surface, have a look at that. It swoops out in and out like that, but then it ties in with a really swoopy section of the floor, something we haven't really seen in F1 so far with this generation of car. And you can see the floor edge just working its way along there past that legality section and then into that cutout section, or combat if you want to look in the Hollywood way. And it's a really different philosophy on the front of the Williams and a really big change for the team. Now, if this works, that could be a bit of a game changer for the middle bit of the Constructors' Championship. And if this setup does work, it could be worth tens of millions of euros of prize money to the Williams team. I expected by this point of the season a lot of teams to kind of have given up on the season and put all of their efforts into next year, but the reality is the field is now so compact, so tight, that we are looking at one of the tightest and closest Constructors' Championship battles in the history of Formula One. And when there's millions of euros at stake, nobody is going to stop fighting. This is going to be a brilliant second half of the Formula One season.